one of the startups I worked for, one of my peers in product management once said to me that if you release something and everybody likes it, you waited too long.
I've heard that too.
I like that.
Minimally viable product. Do we dare admit to ourselves what that actually means?
Hi, I'm Karl.
And I'm Danielle.
And this is Productly Speaking.
We're product managers by trade, and here we explore the world of product management, its people, and their stories.
We promise to keep it entertaining, and maybe you'll learn something. Shall we give this a go?
Let's do it.
For today's episode, we are back at it on one of our favorite topics, product market fit.
Having explored why Zizazoof seeds aren't selling in the Vale of Vavode in Season 0, we're now interested in digging a little deeper and getting perspective other than our own in order to do so.
I'd like to introduce our guest today. His product management career has been a rich one, starting at Prominet and moving into the systems storage group at Sun Microsystems. He was at Sun during the time that Oracle bought Sun, and he continued at Oracle for just over 7 years. After Oracle, he moved on to Red Hat, where he is a product manager for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, covering in-place upgrades, conversions, and live patching. His breadth of experience on industry-leading products makes him a valuable asset to Red Hat and brings a unique perspective on product market fit to the table. We are pleased to welcome to Productly Speaking, Bob Handlin.
Hey, pleasure to be here. Nice to see you guys, meet you guys, as the case may be.
Yeah, so Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself and about what we're going to be talking about on product market fit today.
So I've been in product management for about 20 years now, and different roles. I've done some technical marketing, some product marketing as well. And today, that topic that you mentioned is a really interesting one because I had a very specific experience with that when I was working at Oracle. We had a machine that was very fast against a workload, the kind of 10x fast that makes you want to go after a market, but we came to figure out that it didn't quite fit for other reasons. And I found that an interesting life lesson. So the example I'm talking about is I worked on a product called CFS Storage Appliance, which came out of this brilliant file system technology out of Sun called CFS. And it was really fast, and it kept a lot of things in cache. And the market we tried to enter was VMware. And VMware was dominated by EMC and NetApp. If you don't know that market, those are the companies in that market. We said we could go take that out because we were somewhat similar to the way the NetApp product worked, and we had a product that was really fast against the workload. It turns out, though, that operational integration matters. So while we could blow someone away by actually installing the product and making it go fast behind VMware, you couldn't right-click and build a clone VM the way you could with the NetApp box. And so we would get through the CTO, CIO level of discussion and really get close. And then the operations people would say, I can't work with that. It doesn't work the same way as my NetApp. And I thought, well, this is a fascinating reality. And so it took us a while to learn that. We were hearing that a little bit from our customers. But then the last bit was I actually started to get on airplanes and go from city to city, going to VMware user groups. And cleverly, we would pay for the parking at the event. So you had to come talk to me in order to get validated, right? And so one after the next,
that's a good trick.
To these administrators,
Very good trick.
yeah, right? I thought it was a little cheesy until I actually lived it. And I thought, okay, they at least have to say hello. I can get some conversation started. So we're talking to these people one after the next and saying, this is really good for what you do every day. You should at least buy one of these to go faster on that part of your workload that you need this for, et cetera, et cetera. And, what we started to learn was that people thought that what they had was good enough. Actually, I've lived that one a few times. I had the same thing years ago when I was working on a gigabit Ethernet switch. It was the same basic idea. Like your Cisco switches have head of line blocking. You're going to have all these performance problems if you use the Cisco stuff instead of ours. And finally, I'm talking to someone who's working for Global Crossing. And I said to him, well, how can you use those Cisco switches? They've got head of line blocking, yada, yada, yada. I've got thousands of them. I've never had a problem.
Wow.
It's a very startup-y kind of thing too. You know you're better and you're faster and you're cheaper, but you don't really know why it is that you can't penetrate a market space until you really dig in and find out what that individual end user has to do every day and whether or not the difference you're making matters to them.
That's an interesting point because, I can definitely see that having been at a startup before where, you definitely know you have these key differentiators that ought to be selling you into a market. And yet sometimes you do have trouble actually closing sales in that market, or the sales process takes a long time, or you kind of get into these, well, we don't have X, we don't have Y. So how do you go about kind of digging down into that end user perspective, especially if you're a product manager and between you and the end user is a sales team or a couple of sales teams?
I think the first thing you do is it's basic blocking and tackling stuff. You have to get the requirements. What's the difference between what this is and what you need it to be? And we did a lot of that. And then there's a second step, which is a technical step in a sense. Can you recreate that capability in the thing you have? And can you do it fast enough in a way that impacts this market? I think that's where this idea died for us. Was we got the requirements. We actually had people who understood the requirements and we brought them back. But on some technical details inside the system, we couldn't recreate the little function that allowed the system administrator to do what they wanted to do. And I guess the ultimate sort of failure, was we were working with a large customer in the Midwest, and we gave them the system. And this person who ended up going to work for VMware, just a total VMware expert, ran our product behind what they were doing, and his jaw dropped. It was 10 times faster. And yada, yada, yada. They didn't buy. Same reason.
My goodness.
Couldn't get it in there operationally.
That's big. 10 times faster is big. That's a
10 times. That's usually the metric. Yeah.
I mean, that is money there because, time is money. And if you can go 10 times faster with the same equipment, that's valuable. And yet still not closing the deal.
Right. I had the GM I gave the whole speech of why we were better at this workload. And we had a new GM, Israeli guy, which is interesting because they tend to be very brass tacks. They've all been in the military. They all kind of know each other. It's a cultural thing, I think. No BS kind of person, right? And I give my whole speech to a bunch of field people about how this is the solution for this problem. He pulls me aside. He says, "Bob, do you believe what you just said?" And I said, "Yes, because," and I gave basically the same reasons that were in the presentation. He goes, "Yeah, but do you really believe that we can go get that market?" And I said, "I have to be honest. I was asked to go take that hill and I'm trying to take it."
Yeah.
Interesting product management problem, right?
It is.
We think that we're in the business of trying to figure out what to build, but sometimes we're in the business of trying to figure out what not to build, right?
Yeah. Well, and that gets to a point that we like to talk about. Danielle and I have had a lot of conversations about this where realistically, you've really got to understand the problem before you start going to build. And it almost seems like there was a lot of the problem that was understood. I mean, you made an application that's able to do things 10 times faster than the incumbent, which is amazing. And that in and of itself should absolutely land you a market, but not understanding the jobs to be done on top of that application. And that this has to be just as easy to do as the competitor product to be able to unseat the competitor. Not understanding that aspect of the problem seems to be where that fell down.
An interesting history bit there too. Prior to the product that I was working on, which started at Sun and then moved over to Oracle after the acquisition, I think Sun had tried to launch either 9 or 10, the space is called NAS, Network Attached Storage, NAS products, because Sun looked at the technology. They basically invented NFS, which is the file system technology in that space, right? And they kept building them. And they were always wrong because it isn't just that. It's that plus the way people use it. And that's the hard part. And startups are particularly vulnerable to this because they conceptualize the 10x faster part, right? But they don't necessarily understand that they're coming into a market space where they're chasing the tail of an entrenched competitor that they have to now unseat. In order to unseat that person, you have to be able to provide the right operational fit with your product too. So it can be a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, especially as you're fairly resource constrained in a startup typically. So you've got to be very careful about where you put those scant resources.
100%. And if you find yourself playing catch up in that interface sort of operational level, you're probably not going to catch up. You better be redirecting them to some different place. And those same systems were very, very successful in certain specific workloads where the companies had the resources to worry about just getting this thing to fit it because it was so much faster. If they could just get it to fit, it was worth their time to wriggle it in. That wasn't the case with some VMware administrator who was right-clicking and trying to make new virtual machines every day. They couldn't afford the extra work because that wasn't the key operational part of the job. And, you get all the way back to, yeah, sure. Do you ever see performance problems in those things? Yeah, I do, but not often enough that I am lying awake at night worrying about it. So that is a very cute trick you just did, but I don't really need it. So it kind of played out like that.
Yeah.
Right. Like breaking down that barrier to entry almost. And it doesn't always lie in usability. Sometimes people are really, even if a system is hard to use, they've gotten their own systems around it and they've spent, maybe 20 years doing this job. And so it's easy to them. So even if your product is like 2 clicks to deploy or something, it could be perceived to be difficult.
And not for nothing, but sometimes they're certified on the product they have too. So now you're asking them to change their careers. When we went from Sun to Oracle, Larry Ellison decided he really liked this product. So he made Oracle standardize on it. We mentioned network appliance. Network appliance was what they had standardized on prior to buying Sun. And now he goes into his data centers and he tells his admins, you got to get rid of those and put these in. Half of them quit.
Wow.
They were trained, certified NetApp engineers. They weren't going to deal with this. The half that stayed, for the most part, came to really appreciate the product. And,
sure.
and they ended up with like an exabyte worth of it running in Oracle data centers. Exabyte's a lot. It's amazing what a lift that is. It's not always a better mousetrap. It has to be better in some way that changes the life of the people that have to use it every day. It's not even good enough sometimes to just be better for the business, let's say.
These days with like AI simplifying a lot of folks' process, imagine the translation space, for example. We're now asking Google to translate. We don't need translators. It's not about just changing your career. It's potentially the product you're trying to insert into this company. The end user will lose their job completely. So they're not always incentivized to help or give positive feedback.
We recently saw examples of Duolingo getting rid of a lot of contractors due to AI, and we've also seen Google this year get rid of a lot of people due to AI because now it takes less people to do the job that they were doing before.
And the market's there, but the users aren't.
It comes up as a marketing thing a lot too. Like, don't ever make it your pitch that you're going to save money by costing the person their job. And it's very easy pitch to fall into. When I again working for Oracle, and I remember watching the head of the sales team get up and talk about how Oracle Cloud would cut 30% of the cost versus doing it in your own data center. But in that room, they were admitting that the 30% they were saving was headcount. And so working with a very large customer, they were telling their story, and they said they ran the evaluation themselves, and they found out that using public cloud to solve their problem was actually more expensive. And the reason it was more expensive, because when they did their analysis, they didn't cut out their own jobs.
Yeah. Minor detail
Right.
there.
Minor detail. It's a weird pitch, like to your point, Danielle, right? It's a weird pitch to go into someone and say, buy this product so that your company can save money by not needing you anymore.
Right. It's tough. What sort of data or feedback would you be looking for to identify whether that's the problem or to understand whether the product is where the problem lies?
We developed a discipline not to say that bit about how you're going to save money by taking out your own job. So we ended up focusing more on capability. It takes a while to see it. We were very convinced about that one workload case I was talking about, and it took us a year. I kept going out on the road, getting more and more feedback, going to the engineering teams who said they could actually make the changes needed, but then the changes never came. And I remember one of the more interesting moments in my product management life, because I'd never done this exact thing before, was I went into my boss's office and I sat down and I said, this isn't going to work. Like we are wasting our time on this. We have given it our best shot. There are barriers here we can't overcome. Let's go figure out something else to go after. And this is me I had to actually, I wasn't risking my own job, but I was defeating the sunk cost fallacy, if you know what I'm talking about when I say that. It didn't matter how much time and effort I put into trying to win, to take that hill like I had told the GM prior. It wasn't going to work. And it took a long time to see it. But once I saw it, I just went and told my boss, and then she went and told the VP, and then we stopped worrying about that one.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement to have to go in and tell the boss that, hey, look, I know we've been working on this for a year, but it's just not going to work.
It's an evolution. You have to learn to be confident that that's important. I remember when I first started out in product management, like the dumb product management that we've all done when we were young product managers is just go look at the competitor's website and write down all their features and then try to sort that into some sort of list. And you give it to your team and say, here, go do this. It's understandable form of product management, but it's not a good form of product management. I don't know, Karl, if you were there, but we all sat in a room at Red Hat in, I think, January of 20. We were all retaking mastering product marketing. I don't know that you were there.
I think I was there, actually.
You were there?
December of 19, I think.
Was it?
In Boston.
Yes, that one. And it was all get on the road, primary research, go live in the soup, right? And guess what? It never happened. I had mentioned earlier to you, I think, that we're looking at Red Hat now to try to figure out how to open up into some different spaces that we haven't historically been as strong in because we're so good at the very top end of the market, let's say. And that's a primary research task because it's not a customer we're talking to as much as we talk to the ones we know, right? That muscle maybe went away for a lot of product managers, just getting out and traveling and visiting on speculative basis, let's say, just getting in the soup a little bit and listening to people talk. But it's invaluable stuff. It's exactly what we told ourselves we were going to do back in 19 that we never got to do it. Here we are now. It's, oh, wait, we can do that. We can actually do that now again. I don't know if anyone remembers how anymore, but we can actually do that again. So let's go do that.
When you're grabbing people like that, how do you tell the say-do gap? Like grabbing people as they're walking into an event because you sponsor the car park is such a cool way to get people's attention and to start those conversations. But sometimes there's a lot to sitting down with folks at their computers and watching them do the task that they're doing to learn.
Well, in that example, so first off, it's still kind of like direct mail, where you get a 3 to 4% response. Even if you pay for their parking and you ask them one question, you get a handful of responses and conversation. The say-do was very important there. In fact, one of the things I did during that research is I took a class in VMware System Administration, and this is how things. I've seen this a few times with software, and Danielle, I'm guessing you probably have too. VMware decided not to do their Windows-based client anymore in favor of a web client. They both work, but the click pattern was different between the two. Like you had to relearn your right-clicking and your left-clicking and where things were. This caused an absolute uproar in that community that you would never occur to you that would be a huge problem. Just it's a different sequence of clicks, but give it an hour, you'll figure it out. Oh no, I know my clicks. Please go away. And I think I saw from one of the other. You worked for Intuit. I remember going. The saddest person I ever saw was my accountant the year that he went from his lightning fast text-based, looked like the old Sabre system that they'd use for airline reservations. They made them use a GUI. They were pulling their hair out because they and that's a do, right? I've seen these do's, and that's probably the part we couldn't fix was the do, right? If you can't get the do right, then you can't get that first lip accomplished, and people just see that as more work than I'm willing to do. So,
but it's also an interesting point. You bring up going from a CLI to a GUI, and people that love their CLI or command line interface based tools, they really love them and they really do cling to them. It is possible, and this is probably a controversial take in the CLI community because I like my CLI tools as well, but it is possible to make good graphical user interface versions of tools that wouldn't traditionally be CLI based tools. It is hard. It is very hard, but it is a doable thing. And I find that even after you've done it, convincing the CLI people that the GUI tool is just as good, if not a little bit better, is still a very challenging thing because they're so used to doing it the CLI way.
100% true. In fact, if you decide for yourself that the GUI tool's better, your peers will mock you.
Mm-hmm.
I lived it. I was working technical marketing when it first got acquired into Lucent. And we used to go and do trade shows, and everybody would have their own way of getting their machines up for the show. And I would just bare metal everything, and I would rebuild it, including I would write the system files and everything in the GUI, right? And I was always done first. And they would always laugh at me, and I was always done first. And I thought, this is a really interesting thing. Why is it exactly? Okay, it's all this thing. It's barriers to entry, right? It's a classic problem. Just building a piece of tech that's better than the last piece of tech is not sufficient.
Does it loop back around to, I know we've already mentioned, like, you're trying to convince people who are trained in something to use a different something, and maybe they don't want to retrain, maybe they've had years of experience, maybe you're putting them out of work. But does it loop back around to pride or motivation? Like, many of us in a privileged position in tech kind of don't have to worry about the wages coming in. And a lot of the reason we show up to work is because we're proud of what we're doing. We're the most masterful. Being a CLI person, like being able to code it right there in the command line, like I can be really proud of myself. If it's just a button click, anyone can do it.
Absolutely. That is a huge factor in this. In fact, I saw it first with Solaris administrators working pre-Sun and then for Sun, and then moving in as Linux started to catch on. I believe that one of the most important reasons that Linux grew to the prominence it grew to is that it was good enough at what it did, but it worked the same way as Unix. So those command line jockey types could migrate to the new system, and it felt familiar at the command line. And the command line was, in fact, to your point, where their power lived. Incredible thing to watch, really. But I always felt that. I always felt like, as I was trying to, like I said, put up these machines myself, and I would maybe use the GUI tool, that it was insulting to a command line person or we say command line jockey, that you would actually be able to do something properly with the GUI. It just didn't make any sense to them at all.
And having used both command line interface and GUI, and loving tools that live natively in both, that blows my mind, to be honest. I have a hard time understanding that perspective, even though I know it's very much out there.
Yeah. When before I was in storage, I was in networking, and Cisco was dominating, and they had an operating system called iOS. That was the same thing. It was a command. You build a command script, and when you fire up your router, it runs this command script. And they did an actually brilliant thing that I haven't seen others do. Maybe they have, but I haven't seen other examples of it. If you used a Cisco GUI, it wrote out an iOS file. The format didn't change if you used the GUI. So the command line jockey could open up that script that the tool created, and it would be in the form of Cisco commands that they knew. And every time I wish I had $1 for every time I went to people who build interfaces and say, do that. Have it spit out, in the case of a Linux operating system, let's say, have that thing spit out a shell script instead of having it spit out some binary format in a database that is different from what they're used to. And if you don't have the new thing in your tool yet, let it open up a command window. Just bridge the gap. But I think that's where they fall short. We have some of that now, actually. We are building a growing capability into a user interface, part of which is to go after this maybe more mid-sized market, the less command line hero type person. One of the things that is going to become a problem at some point is that I think we're still in the mode where the thing can arrive in the GUI after it exists as a function, after some bit of lag. Well, that means that your users who standardize on your GUI can't use the new thing. That you have to get out of that at some point. You have to eventually get to a point where you can deliver both in the same day, so that you're not servicing one community with better functionality than the other. So, but I think it's very common. I think the GUI always comes as a follow-on. And that's another reason that maybe affects adoption a little bit.
Yeah. At my last job, we very much started with the CLI-based installation tool, and then we rolled out the GUI, and there was a lot of who moved my cheese in that move. Even though the GUI actually made a better configuration experience and a better overall driving experience, people still wanted to edit their 20 text files and put values in.
Right. Always. That will persist, I think. We have this thing now as a product management problem. We have to keep two backlogs because of it, right? You have to have a backlog for the creation of the function, and then you have to have a backlog for the integration of it into the management tools. And unless you have enough resources to not do that, then that's just the way it has to be. We had an engineering manager who was saying, let's make a unified backlog. This is, how do we prioritize things if we can't do that? And I was like, well, I understand what you're saying, but the only way to do that when the resources are a little unbalanced is to say the feature has to wait until all the tools have time to integrate it.
Yeah.
That's never a thing.
Well, I mean, it would be ideal if everything was ready to go when it came launch time, and it wasn't just it works over here, but not in this other tool.
If you get big enough and boring enough, companies start to be able to do that. But it's really a late stage thing when you're still solving original problems. And it's funny. It's an interesting thing when it comes to Red Hat. We're big, but we're not that big. I've worked for other big companies that are solving problems at the scale of Red Hat, and they have like 100,000 people working for them. And Red Hat has nowhere near that many. So, I mean, a lot of that has to do with upstream and open source and the way we develop software, but we don't have enough people to just do all the things all the time. Like maybe you do if you're building a proprietary piece of software, and you have to figure out what that means. Actually, it comes back to product management too. You have to figure out which things are actually important to do and when they're important to do them, and whether you can get by without having to do them all right away.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating point, because it doesn't matter how small you are or how big you are. You never have enough people to do all the things that you've identified on your plate. So prioritization is just absolutely key, because Red Hat's roughly 20,000 people. At a startup, you've got 200 or less.
Right.
You don't have enough people there, and you don't have enough people at Red Hat.
Exactly. And it's fascinating. I remember one of the startups I worked for, one of my peers in product management once said to me that if you release something and everybody likes it, you waited too long.
I've heard that too.
I like that.
Minimally viable product. Do we dare admit to ourselves what that actually means?
Yes. Minimally viable is pretty minimal.
We used to have this. The other thing is, and Karl's familiar with this, we used to have this thing at Red Hat. We try to use it vanishingly few times now. We call it Tech Preview.
Oh, yeah.
And what Tech Preview was, we're going to put it out there, but we didn't really finish it.
Yep.
So we're going to let you experiment with something that we're telling you doesn't quite work right yet. And you know how many people actually would experiment with something that didn't quite work right yet? Almost zero. That was the worst part, but it was a way of it's the same idea, minimally viable. I feel like sometimes minimally viable product is a way of saying we didn't get as far as we needed to, but we're going to release it anyways.
It's similar to putting things like behind labs flags and like B2C type products. Danielle, I know you have a little bit of experience with functionality going behind labs. You see similar usage patterns on that?
It depends on your audience. I think in one of my B2C experiences, that labs flag, folks just weren't excited about finding it, and so they didn't turn it on. And then in another of my B2C experiences, you've got early adopters to new tech, and so they're really excited to play with labs flags, and they're kind of your QAs. Like they want to break it, and they want to give you feedback, and they want to build the product with you. So I really think it just depends on the kind of humans that you're going after, or what that market looks like, and how much time they have for this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and in B2B, you tend to not find people with a lot of time to play with your newest crazy invention. They just need something that works and move on with the rest of their day.
We always think that brand is more important in business to consumer, but brand is proven out to be way, way more important in B2B. And it's because of the complexity that they have to deal with in a lot of these enterprise data centers, as an example. Again, we keep going to the same space that Karl and I are familiar with. They are incredibly risk averse. So you're asking them, it doesn't matter if it works on their one system in that kind of environment. It has to work in the environment. It has to scale properly and all that other stuff. And if they can't call you for support because you've called it something pre-production-y, experimental, they can't do the experiment they need to do. And so I think that's probably the other reason is it's a market thing. I think even product managers can sometimes fall into that trap, though. You want the thing to get out there because you've worked hard on it for a long time. And yeah, sure, the 3 or 4 things that you really thought needed to be there before you could hit the go button aren't there yet. But it's been a really long time. Management's upset. You don't want your engineers to feel unmotivated. So you just kind of put it out. We had some really strong voices inside Red Hat, and I think they were right. Like, we really shouldn't do that. Just finish it first and then put it out.
Well, and especially, like you said, the larger you get, and while Red Hat's not as large as some organizations, it's certainly a lot bigger than a lot of companies that are out there, and it's certainly got a lot of resources to it to be able to do things like that, to be able to afford to finish a feature before actually releasing it to market.
Right. That's a huge one. A lot of times with these small companies, you have a clock ticking at all times because of your fundraising.
Yeah. You don't have time to do it because you don't have runway. And if you don't sell enough or raise enough new funding, there's not going to be the runway or the time to do it. So you just have to scrap the idea and go for the core idea.
Without knowing what the core idea is yet, you don't know what your market is until you get there sometimes, which is fascinating. I was thinking about this in anticipation of talking to you guys about how often startups don't really know what the product's for. They know what it is. They have a sense of where it might fit, but they don't really know who and what it's for until they actually get it out there sometimes. It's a fascinating thing. Like, it's not really a product manager. It's not a product management problem. It's can I make this thing sound interesting enough to get someone to invest in it problem?
Mm-hmm.
And then they build the thing. And, it's only after you build it that you figure out these things we've been talking about this whole time, that it doesn't quite do this or that. And that's a problem.
In a similar vein, how do you find those markets for your thing? Or, it's kind of the same question as if you're a market leader like Red Hat is. How would you find new markets to go into that you may just be able to walk right into if you knew they were there? And it's kind of the same idea from a startup. Well, okay, you've got your thing. How do you actually go find that market?
We live through it every day now. We're working in a mature technology in a mature market, right? That can make you bucket loads of money for a really long time, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee down the road growth. So you have to start finding these new markets, and you're exactly right about that. They always tell you you can't find the new market by listening to the customers you already have, because by definition you already have them. But boy, it's really hard to get around that one. You're talking to customers all the time, and you feel like that gives you the sense you need of what you're doing right and wrong and where you need to go next. You have to figure out how to have a conversation about your thing with that customer who doesn't care about your thing yet. But they might, to your point, they might if they knew what it was. Again, we're living that now as we've identified certain growth opportunities, but one of them is taking the same product with the same capabilities and going after a customer segment we feel like we're applicable to, but we don't really know how to talk to yet. And you have to go figure out what the entry cost is for that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
That's a good point to bring up, that there's always an entry cost into a market. You're not just going to walk into a market unless you get really, really lucky. Most of the time, you're going to have to pay to play.
100%.
That cost could be in time as well as resources, or it could be in quality, right? We've already talked about releasing the MVP that's not quite good enough. That's a quality cost. Resourcing cost of, how many humans do I have to throw at this problem to make it worth doing? And then time. I think sometimes when you're breaking into a new market, people don't give it enough time. Something Intuit used to say is if they were opening a new office, that it would be a 7-year clock before they then decided to close that office in that region, which 7 years is a lot of time. But you're just not going to get traction in a market unless you dedicate that much to it. But, startups don't have that same privilege.
That's very true.
And it's a huge product problem, because a lot of times when you start, even a healthy company, if they sort of see like a flattening of one of their market space or something, a lot of times they start looking then. If you start looking at that moment, you don't have 7 years to figure it out.
Right. How do you know when a flat is a good flat versus a bad flat?
Flat isn't allowed because tech is always priced for growth. So I find that the weirdest part. You could have this gigantic business, but if it's not growing at the prior pace, you're failing. And that's a fail.
Yeah, but, that's the venture and market culture that we've got around being publicly traded or being venture backed. Either of those will put you in that scenario, because investors always want that growth. It still grew. Yes, it was only 5%. It wasn't the 11% you expected, but it grew 5%.
Yes. And it's throwing off cash in large buckets, but ignore all that. It's a failure the way that the investors saw it, they're over. The biggest thing when you really dig to the bottom of that is the companies themselves are overvalued. Yeah. They're valued against the growth, right? So everyone's trying to figure out if you're Apple. It's kind of not very realistic that there's a lot of apples out there. So yeah, it can be frustrating in a really healthy business that the expectation comes from without, and you're not even putting the expectation on yourself. You know that what you're doing is the right thing. You know that actually the way it's cycling right now is fine and healthy based on because no one knows your business the way you do, right? But they're comparing it to things that aren't quite the same and saying, well, you're not doing what this one's doing over here, so therefore you're not as successful as you could be. Interesting. It's not but then none of that's a product problem. No, that's a strategy. People with much larger paychecks than me get to go figure that out.
Yeah, except when you're in a startup and then you get to do strategy and product and everything all at one time.
Strategy at a startup is simple. If we could just capture 1% of this $12 billion market,
we'd be set.
Yeah.
And then what is it, like 80-90% of startups fail or something like that? It's some ungodly high number.
1 in 10 or 1 in 20, depending on the moment. There are times when that changes, I guess, when tech gets hot or something. And I wouldn't feel horrible pitching an AI product to VCs right now.
There's a lot of people doing just that.
Right. And they're probably getting funded.
They are. There's a lot of Series A and Series B AI companies out there right now.
Why not place a few bets, right? I wonder how that actually, I don't know how that would boil down to product. I feel like I've been at startups where I could sense that there was something going on that was really amazing. And then ones that were just people who were good at talking, let's say. And I've lived through both. I've seen both be successful, which is interesting. I've actually seen good products fail, and I've seen, mediocre products achieve a good outcome, let's say.
Yeah.
And so it's a complicated thing, and it's not always a product thing. We as product people, we can only control what we can control. I was around when the tech bubble collapsed after the sort of Netscape boom, and then about 2000, 2001, everything fell apart. What really happened was everybody bought all new stuff for Y2K, and they didn't buy anything for the next 2 years.
Yeah,
and the whole tech thing went into a depression, right? While tech was collapsing and all these startups that were lavishly funded and had all this money to burn were failing left and right. And they were polling the employees. And the most common reason the employees felt their companies were failing was bad management.
Yeah.
It was clearly market dynamic. It was clearly the tech bubble collapsing. It was poor choices and poorly spent money and all these other things. Talk about a classic perception versus reality thing. Well, this is what we live. We can't always overcome perception with product, I guess is the way to do it. So
yeah,
we can build we can work together and build great products, but in order for them to succeed, you got to have all those other gears too.
Well, Danielle, did you want to close us out with a closing question?
You are going to wake up tomorrow anywhere in the world. What would you choose to do with your day, and where would you wake up?
Wow. I would wake up in my office getting ready to talk to Karl and Danielle, because that's really fun. I really like to talk.
That's the right answer. Pass the test.
I'm speechless. I don't have anything else to say to that. That was great.
I would not be going down to buy coffee beans from a roaster because I didn't want to have to put half and half of my coffee. That I would not be doing.
It's all about the instant coffee. You're on my team.
Instant coffee.
Go somewhere in the middle, but yeah.
I will say one thing on the instant coffee thing. I have seen specialty roasters start to have their coffees as instant coffee, which is an interesting.
That is interesting
scenario.
My excuse for having instant coffee in the house is because it's good to make coffee flavored cake.
I arrived in the first time I went to Australia on business. I arrived in Sydney and went straight to the office, and all they had in the break room was, freeze dried instant coffee, let's say. And I made myself, I thought these people must not care very much about coffee. They didn't even have brewed coffee in here. Oh, no. The only reason they had that there was that you could not get, it was beneath them to drink coffee that had originated in the office. You had to leave the building to get a proper cup of coffee, and they all did. And so, I guess the existence of the instant coffee can be deceiving on that front. It can be that brewed coffee is beneath them.
Yeah. That's fun.
I can see that. So, Karl, what were your takeaways?
Yeah, I really liked where Bob talked about where does your power live? That whole concept of you're coming in with a product, and yet it may actually be displacing the very people that need to use it, or it may be making them relearn something that they've spent their entire career becoming the expert in. So that was pretty important, because a lot of times we don't necessarily think about the displacement factor of bringing a better product to a client and about how that may actually impact the people that are using it. Also, another thing that really stuck to me that Bob talked about was, what is the entry cost to a market? That there is always going to be an entry cost to a market. You've got to plan on that when you want to go look at a new market. You can't just go pivot and say, hey, new market, here's exactly what I have. each market's going to talk a different way, and you're going to have to spend time researching that and understanding how those people talk and going to their conferences, starting to talk to those people to see if what you're saying resonates, or if you need to change what you're saying to try to resonate, or if you don't have any chance at all in that market. And that's an important thing. And those are costs that you have to bear to be able to do that. Danielle, what did you take away from today's session?
Yeah, I agree with both of the things that you picked up on and talked about there. I really liked them as well. I think the ones that stood out for me were that consideration for the operational integration of your product into an environment. That's why we're here building products, is to go after problems. And so it's likely that your target market already has some form of solution and you're trying to displace that. And so understanding that operational piece of how does this fit in, and then recognizing that you can't overcome perception with product. Like, you've got this perception, a product's not always going to fix it. Even if that product is 10 times faster than the thing that you're dealing with right now, if it's perceived to be not cool, or it's perceived to be, it's gooey, it's too easy, I want to stick around in my command line. That's a really hard thing, and it can't be done with just product alone. So that's what stood out for me. How about you guys? Let us know what your takeaways were. What comments really made you think? What new thoughts did you have listening to the podcast today?
Drop us a line at hello@productlyspeaking.com, or join the chat on Matrix at #productlyspeaking:matrix.org. Also, follow our page on LinkedIn to get the latest updates. We'd love to hear from you. This has been Productly Speaking.
Thank you for tuning in. If you like what you heard, subscribe. Make sure you don't miss any episodes.
Also, share our podcast with your friends and anyone you think might enjoy listening to an American and a Brit natter on about product management.
I don't think you can call it nattering.
I guess actually we did stay on topic, and it's not technically nattering.
Exactly. Well, what did you guys think? Leave us some feedback. Make sure to visit us at www.productlyspeaking.com. Send us an email at hello@productlyspeaking.com, or join the chat on Matrix at #productlyspeaking:matrix.org. Thank you all again, and until next time, cheerio.